Good evening, and thank you all for coming to witness and engage with our Rutgers-Newark community as we conceptualize freedom. I want to begin by inviting anyone in the back, if you'd like, to move a little bit closer to the front in the event that we have folks filing in a little bit later. My name is Melissa Cooper. I'm an assistant professor of history here at Rutgers-Newark. I'm also the author of a book titled Making Gullah, The History of Sapelo Islanders' Race in the American Imagination. Okay. Uh, we are very happy to engage in this conversation tonight. The program has benefited from the generous institutional support of so many people and units on campus, including the Chancellor Cantor's Commission on Diversity and Transformation, the Price Institute, the New Arts Social Justice Initiative at Express Newark, the African American Studies Program, the History Department, and the Rutgers-Newark Trust Racial Healing and Transformation Campus Center. We'd like to thank all of those units for making tonight's program possible. And thank you to the Executive Vice Chancellor, Sherry Ann Butterfield, Laura Triano, Mark Krasovitz, Natalia Aikiola, all for your efforts and your help in ensuring that this program will be a success. Among my fellow historians and other scholars who study Black history and Black life and culture, there is absolutely no way to talk about the Black freedom struggle without talking about Dr. Barbara Ransby's work. No way. Dr. Ransby received her BA from Columbia University, her PhD in history from the University of Michigan. She's a writer, a historian, and a longtime activist. She's the author of 2 award-winning books, Ella Baker and the Black Freedom Movement, A Radical Democratic Vision, and Eslanda, The Large and Unconventional Life of Mrs. Paul Robeson. She is also the author of a 3rd book, Making All Black Lives Matter, Reimagining Freedom in the 21st Century. The Ella Baker book received 8 National Book Awards and recognitions, including the Liberty Legacy Award from the Organization of American Historians and the Joan Kelly Prize from the American Historical Association. Eslanda was the recipient of the Letitia Wood Brown Memorial Prize for the Best Book in African American Women's History in 2013. Dr. Ransby's contributions to the Black freedom struggle extend far beyond the pages of the books that she's authored. She's a distinguished professor in the Department of African American Studies and Gender and Women's Studies and History at the University of Illinois at Chicago. She directs a campus-wide social justice initiative, a project that promotes and connects academics and community organizers who are doing social justice work. Dr. Ransby is also very busy performing editorial tasks. She's the editor-in-chief of Soul's Journal. She works with an editorial group in London that deals with race and class. She's a president of the National Women's Studies Association, and she still publishes in leading journals and writes articles for the Times, Color Lines, Boston Review. I could go on and on. Needless to say that we are very happy and honored to have Dr. Ransby here with us this evening. We're also eagerly anticipating the conversation that will follow Dr. Ransby's talk, a conversation in which the panelists will grapple with reimagining freedom in this dangerous and hopeful moment. Our first panelist, Dr. Salamishah Tillet, is also the primary organizer of tonight's event and a new addition to the Rutgers-Newark family. Thank you so much, Dr. Tillet, for bringing your visionary leadership to Rutgers-Newark. Dr. Tillet is a Henry Rutgers Professor of African American and African Studies and a faculty member of the MFA in Creative Writing program here at Rutgers-Newark. She's the Associate Director of the Clement A. Price Institute on Ethnicity and Culture in the Modern Experience and the founding director of the New Arts Social Justice Initiative at Express Newark. A contributing culture critic for the New York Times, Tillet is the author of Sites of Slavery, Citizenship, and Racial Democracy in the Post-Civil Rights America, and currently is working on two book projects, In Search of the Color Purple and All the Rage, Mississippi Goddamn, and the World Nina Simone Made. In 2003, she and her sister co-founded The Long Walk Home, a Chicago-based nonprofit that uses art to empower young people and end violence against girls and women. Imani Brown is also one of our panelists for our conversation this evening. Imani is a queer Afro-Caribbean immigrant activist and writer who grew up in Trinidad and Tobago and is now based in Brooklyn, New York. She's one of the founding members of the New York City chapter of BYP 100, a national member-based organization, and the Black 18 to 35-year-old activists and comprised of Black 18 to 35-year-old organizers and activists. She's dedicated to creating justice and freedom for all Black people. Prior to BYP 100, she was a member of the Students Against Mass Incarceration and was one of the organizers of Columbia Prison Divest campaign, which was able to successfully push the university to divest the nearly $10 million in stocks it invested in private prison companies. She's passionate about cooking, dancing, and teaching, and is deeply committed to creating a world in which Black women and girls and femmes are safe and free from state-sanctioned violence. Welcome. Nyle Forte will also join our panel conversation. Nyle Forte is a minister, activist, and PhD student at Princeton University. After traveling to Ferguson, Missouri to help build the movement for Black lives, Nyle created Strange Fruit Speaks, a Black church liturgy commemorating the last words of African Americans killed by police and vigilantes, as well as Newark Books and Breakfast, a monthly political education program providing free books and breakfast to local youth and families. So let us all witness and engage in this freedom conversation.
Good evening. All right. I had to hug her after that lovely introduction, right? I'm so happy and honored to be here, truly. I am happy to be here for a whole number of reasons, but my dear friend and colleague, Salamisha Tillet, who has come here to work her magic at Newark, Rutgers-Newark. I'm very excited about that and just happy that she invited me and made this possible. And a double treat is that I have a number of friends and colleagues and co-conspirators here who have helped me to make my work relevant, but also given meaning to the work that tries to bridge academia and community, that tries to create spaces within academia for social justice and racial justice work unapologetically. People like Jack Chin and Tim Eatman and Sherry Ann Butterfield are in that category of people. I also want to give a special shout out to Chancellor Nancy Cantor. You all are so fortunate to have her here. And I said to her, whenever I'm on a search committee, I always say, do we have a Nancy Cantor on the list? And the answer is always no, because there's only one who really is committed to social justice in a very profound way, and it's unafraid to stand up to folks in academia who have a different vision. And when we see universities going in the direction of neoliberal corporations, right, it is really a breath of fresh air and really an oasis for experimentation and important work to have somebody like Nancy Cantor at the helm. So that makes it a very special it makes it very special for me to be here. I also want to thank family and friends who are in the audience. I lived in New York for a number of years, and many of my peeps are here. And I also want to thank my two interlocutors. My three interlocutors, in addition to Professor Tillet, Nyle Forte, and Imani Brown, two young activists who, when I read the newspaper and get depressed, I think about people like them and the work they do and the brilliance that they bring. So I'm so happy that they're here. I think the last time I was at Rutgers-Newark was in February of 2014. And I was here to participate in the Marion Thompson Wright lecture for the city. Clement Price was there. He was full of life and full of joy and full of provocative questions, but always full of grace and gentleness and a supportive word. So I am very mindful of the new institute that bears his name, and I'm just thinking of him this evening as well. A very different collaborator and old friend that I think of when I come to Newark is Amiri Baraka, who I argued with and struggled with for many years in the Black Radical Congress, but at his core, I think he was committed to freedom for Black people and all people, and so I think of him in Newark, where he did most of his work. So tonight I'm going to talk very briefly, and then I'm going to invite my friends and colleagues to be in conversation with me, because they have as much or more to say than I do. And the book is really, above all, an excuse to have a conversation about how we can get free. So I wrote this book for a number of reasons. I was a bit of a reluctant writer. I jokingly say I'm a historian. I'm used to writing about dead people. And these people are very much alive and in motion, so to kind of capture the momentum of this movement, the movement for Black lives, the Black Lives Matter movement, was a challenge. And also, I love and adore and fight with people in the movement all the time. So what to include, how to make it an offering, how to make it constructive and still honest was my challenge and my goal. But also, how can it spark discussions? How can we look at the work we're doing, or those of us who want to become involved, how can we look at the movement as it's unfolded and extract some lessons that help us map our way forward? It's a very difficult and dangerous time that we're in. And if there was any time that we need to talk about large, inclusive, broad-based visionary movements, it's now. So I see the book as an opportunity to have conversations with like-minded people to see how we can do this work better. So I want to focus this evening, just in my very brief remarks, I want to focus on the subtitle of the book, which is Reimagining Freedom in the 21st Century, because that's really what we need to do. We need to reimagine the way we think about leadership. We need to reimagine how we think about community. We need to rethink how we understand oppression, because even I'm a very strong critic of capitalism as a political and economic model for organizing society. But we have to rethink how we even critique capitalism, because capitalism has changed and evolved over time in important ways. We don't have the luxury to be stagnant in our imaginaries about what kind of society we can build. And I think in a lot of ways, the movement for Black lives over the last 5 years or so has provoked us in new and important ways to rethink all of these things. So to jumpstart the discussion and just to sort of highlight some of the points I try to make in the book, I have 5 points that I want to make for people who like to enumerate. Like, is she almost done yet? So when I get to 4, I'm almost done. One is that I think this movement intervened at a particular political moment that really challenged and broke with the politics of respectability. It also intervened in a very misguided hype about post-racialism that dominated the Obama era. So here we have the largest upsurge in Black confrontational radical politics at the moment that we have the first Black elected president, right? That's not a coincidence. And for a lot of the young activists who have been involved in the movement for Black lives and Black Lives Matter, which, by the way, includes a myriad of organizations, not just one organization that gets reduced to that sometimes, but it's a whole ecosystem of organizations. People interrupted that discourse and said, no, here's what racism and white supremacy look like in this moment with a black family in the White House, right? That has not liberated everybody else, and particularly looking at poor and working class black folks, looking at queer and LGBT folks. This was the intervention to say, no, we're not buying the hype of a certain kind of symbolism, that we understand that black or brown faces in high places is not going to liberate us, that hasn't liberated us, and not being afraid to break the silence around that. And I think there was fear. There was fear because in a sense, there were so many racist attacks against Obama that there was a silencing of legitimate criticism. And I think Black Lives Matter broke that silence in really important ways. So that's one point that I try to wrestle with. And I try to remind us of the ascendant trajectory of respectability politics before the movement for Black Lives. I mean, thinking of, now, disgraced Bill Cosby, who was telling black people you need to name your children different and pull your pants up and, correct yourself, right? Individual solutions to systemic problems. That was a part of a kind of message about respectability politics. Very gendered, very patriarchal. And Barack Obama himself, in a number of speeches, very classic ones, one at Morehouse, talked about corrective measures that black folks needed to take to deal with our circumstances rather than, again, looking at a pattern, looking at structures, looking at systemic problems. So all of that is a part of what we call respectability politics. Like you gotta, kind of straighten yourself up, clean yourself up, act right, do right, and you'll get a little bit of citizenship, you'll get a little bit of economic resources and so forth. That hasn't quite worked out that way. But the disruption, the intervention, the vocal protests around Trayvon Martin, around Mike Brown, was a really important intervention. Significant also, and related to breaking with the politics of respectability, is the class politics of this movement, right? Now, of course, there are exceptions to this, but in general, the people who the police are shooting, the black people who police are shooting, are not college professors, are not black CEOs and bank presidents, are not physicians and dentists, but they're poor and working class black people, right? And so in a sense, this movement said, you don't have to be a saint, you don't have to be traditionally successful or any of that to be a sympathetic victim, to be deserving of our mourning and deserving of our rage, right, at these deaths. So let's be clear, this movement was about the state violence that is rained down upon poor and working class black people. When we think of people like Alton Sterling, Eric Garner, Walter Scott, people who were involved in the informal economy, people who had been pushed out of various institutions, who had been pushed out of the formal economy, people who were living on the margins, right, of the society and of certainly the economic progress that we're told is going on in this society at this moment. I just want to read one little excerpt from Gwen Carr, who was the mother of Eric Garner, and I think she really says it all with powerful eloquence. She says, "My son Eric died last year at the hands of the men who were supposed to protect him. At the time, he was selling cigarettes to support his family, Lucy's, if you recall, in Staten Island. These two things, of course, are connected," meaning his death and his selling the cigarettes. "They reflect the ongoing struggle the black community faces every day for racial and economic justice. They're at the heart of the Black Lives Matter movement. Eric's senseless death has forced our country to confront the toxic effects of police brutality. My hope is that together we can also change the system that trapped him and so many black men and women across our city and nation in poverty too." So she was very clear that it was about state violence, and that one aspect of that state violence was poverty. The third point that I want to make is the importance, the profound importance of Black feminist politics in guiding this movement. I would argue that the ideological bedrock of the movement for Black lives has been Black feminism, particularly the politics of intersectionality, and I know we need a less cumbersome term at some point. Somebody's working on that. But intersectionality just meaning, you know, the ways in which various systems of oppression, racial oppression, class oppression, oppression of LGBTQ folks, disability, oppression of disability communities, that all of these systems of hierarchy and discrimination and oppression work in intimate concert, right? And that has been a bedrock of Black feminist thought, including a critique, right, of the economic disparities that define capitalism, the exploitation that defines capitalism. So those ideas, bringing the marginal to the center, having decentralized forms of leadership, these are basic precepts of Black feminist thought going back to the Combahee River Collective in 1977. And in interview after interview, and speech after speech, in document after document, on t-shirt after t-shirt, this movement has embraced those ideas. In addition to working class and poor male victims that were held up and honored and mourned through the protests, organizers also said that all the victims of state violence are not men. So they said essentially that we cannot understand and mourn Trayvon Martin without also understanding and mourning what happened to Marissa Alexander. We cannot mourn and understand what happened to Freddie Gray in Baltimore without also understanding and mourning what happened to Corinne Gaines in Baltimore County. We cannot understand and mourn what happened to Laquan McDonald, shot 16 times in Chicago, without also mourning and understanding what happened to 22-year-old Rekia Boyd in that same city. The Say Her Name campaign held up these voices, these names of women victims of state violence, and said this has to be a part of our conversation if we're serious about justice. The fourth characteristic of this movement that I try to talk about is the new forms of organization and leadership that emerged. Now, we have seen some media celebrities emerge out of the movement, but in its primary focus has been to jettison old forms or old norms about leadership, the kind of messiah model of leadership, the charismatic, patriarchal male leader who knows all, who leads the flock to freedom. That is something that this movement has flatly rejected. They were criticized early on for being a leaderless movement, and Patrice Kahn-Culler's response was, we are a leaderful movement. And that was a beautiful thing, but I also am quick to remind us that leaderful doesn't mean you don't have leaders, right? It's not leader, because the media didn't see someone on high, being very charismatic, being very prominent, a single person, they assumed leaderlessness. But leaderful also means you do the work of leading. You do the work of organizing. You do the work of convening. That is work, right? It's a responsibility, and there are people who've taken that up in all these organizations that have emerged, local organizations and national ones. There are also a set of organizations that have worked in a really important, I think, and powerful way behind the scenes, and very much in Ella Baker's tradition. I call them political quilters, and there are three organizations that I talk about that played that role in Black Lives Matter and the movement for Black Lives. They are the Blackout Collective began in Oakland, which is a group of folks that go around doing tactical training. So all the dramatic tactics of wading out into traffic to stop traffic, to bring attention to the issues, which always makes my heart skip a beat. When there's massive civil disobedience that shuts down buildings, there are people that get trained to do that. I was just in San Diego at an immigration rights demonstration, and as we were marching through San Diego, it was about the family separations. These young people come floating down from the side of the building with this huge, several story long banner that said, justice for our families. That you don't just get up on Saturday morning and go out and do that. So there's been training, and Blackout Collective has been a part of that Another organization, Blackbird, which went into Ferguson and provided certain kinds of communication and tactical support. And then an organization called BOLD, Black Organizing for Leadership and Development and Dignity, which is based in the South. They meet at a retreat site in North Carolina, but many of the young leaders in the movement for Black Lives have gone through BOLD training. And it's about how do you sustain yourself as a leader? How do you sustain each other? What skills do you need? What resources do you need? What internal strength do you need to sustain yourself in this work? And they're very good at bolstering people in that way. So those are organizations I see as kind of the connective tissue between different parts of this ongoing movement. The fifth thing I'll say that I think is very important that sometimes gets shortchanged is because there have been so many vibrant local struggles from Chicago to Oakland to Atlanta to New York, we sometimes forget about the international connections that this movement has made. They have taken some controversial stances. A number of delegations, primarily led by the Dream Defenders in Florida, have gone to Palestine, made statements of solidarity with the Palestinian people there. Others have gone to Brazil and met with the landless workers movement, and still others have gone to Haiti, to South Africa, and elsewhere. So the internationalism, I think, is in the best tradition of the Black freedom movement because none of this work happens in a vacuum. And when we see what's playing out in Washington, D.C. right now, when we see some of the most ominous examples of emerging fascism, to be quite blunt, we see that lessons are being extracted from similar regimes all over the world. And so movements of resistance, movements that have a different vision of the future, have to have an internationalist perspective as well. So those are my 5 points. I did 5, right? Sometimes I lose track and I do 4.5. But what I want to leave you with before we shift to the conversation is the epilogue of the book, which is very short and very personal. And it really speaks to why I wrote the book. And, I just sat in a coffee shop for a long time and wrote this. There were no footnotes. There were no, it was just me. So I want to share this. And I know there are a number of activists in the audience, so they will appreciate some of the details of it too. I struggled to complete this book while engaging in and supporting the ongoing resistance against a new proto-fascist turn in US politics, one in which racism, misogyny, and all varieties of xenophobia are alarmingly pronounced. In my effort to make sense of an ever-changing national and global landscape, I hope that this book makes some small contribution to the freedom-making work that lies ahead of us. If Alicia Garza's initial Facebook post in 2013 was a love letter to Black people, then this is a love letter to the movement for Black lives and a tribute to its organizers' expansive vision. First of all, thank you. Thank you for your courage and your passion, your savvy and your boldness. Thank you for facing the bloody reality embedded in the historical fibers of this country that have become all too routine, and saying no. And in saying no, you brazenly rejected the bourgeois trappings of respectability. In other words, you said hell no to state violence in its crudest form, as well as the slow death that racial capitalism and its neoliberal practices have caused over time. Your practice reflects an understanding that only when elites cannot buy you off, dazzle you with their power, intoxicate you with a sense of your own importance, and tempt you with trinkets and access to money and celebrity can you truly engage in a liberatory process of freedom-making. For many of you, this time has already come. When amazing Chicago organizer Aislinn Pulley declined an invitation to the White House without blinking because she did not want to be a part of a photo op with no outcome, we all felt a little bit freer. When Black brunch protesters strolled into fancy eateries and began to impolitely talk about Black death, breaking the bubble that shrouds privilege, we knew we were all a little bit freer. When you refused to be Al Sharpton's proteges or political accessories or the human backdrop to his press conferences, we knew we were a little bit freer. When Bree Newsom climbed up a South Carolina flagpole and yanked down that Confederate flag, we knew we were a little bit freer. And when the respected Southern-based organizer Mary Hooks told us, as only she could, to pool our dollars, to use them as crowbars to pry open the cages and free our sisters during the Black Mamas bailout campaign, we all felt a little bit freer. Acts of defiance, disruption, and insurgent rule-breaking are ways that we de-link from the politics of routine, of acclamation, of compromise and collaboration. To paraphrase James Baldwin, it is when we demand the impossible that we come closest to real freedom. What do I see when I look at this cohort of activists? I see the faces of 13-year-olds peering out of the narrow windows at the Juvenile Detention Center in Chicago, seeing hundreds of young activists marching through the chilly night, holding up signs saying, "We love you." I see you on ladders, wrapped in chains, holding flags and banners. I see you daringly wading into rush hour traffic on major highways to force people to look at the reality of Black death, determined in the spirit of No Pasarán. I see Josh and Jasmine peering from behind cold steel bars, and I see Marshawn dead on the steps of the Ohio State House. I see you crying quietly at the back of the church at Alton Sterling's funeral, and standing alongside Eric's daughter, Tamir's mother, Rakia's brother. I see you in a hot, crowded little house in Havana, drinking beer and talking politics in 2 languages, in a dusty refugee camp in Ramallah, in a favela in Rio after meeting with the landless workers movement, comparing notes about displacement, and in shanty towns outside Johannesburg, trying to make sense of a revolution gone astray. But above all, I hear you insisting that this is a world family, and the struggle goes far beyond the borders that the colonizers have carved out in the earth. And even when we disagree, we are dancing the same dance. Finally, I see you building political altars, paying homage to the wisdom of grandmothers and grandfathers, knowing all the while that your eyes will see and your hands will build a world they could only have imagined. And when you chant, "We know that we will win," in spiraling crescendo, I believe you. I believe you with love and hope and expectation, all wrapped around you in a fierce and unrelenting embrace. Thanks.
So I'm Salamishah, and I'm gonna act as moderator for this conversation. I'll add stuff too, but primarily here to facilitate the conversation. And thank you, Barbara, for this book, for being the activist and scholar that you are, your work, and I want to talk about this more in detail conversation, but your work resonates and helps shape so much of BYP, I think, and the scholarship that you did and the organizing that you do. So thank you for that. And then just thank you personally, because she was one of my guides as I was deciding to come here. So I spoke to Barbara. We had meetings in New Orleans and things like that, and on the phone. We'd had a lot of conversations. So in different stages of my own professional development, Barbara's been very instrumental. Thank you. And okay, so I just want to start off. Nyle is also another wonderful interlocutor, and we've had lunches in Newark at stages of our own development too. So, and I'm happy to meet you, Imani, as well. So I guess I want to start off with, this is in many ways, what's hard about this book, I think, is it's a book in which you're kind of theorizing in real time what's happening. So we know that the movement for Black Lives Matter is engaging these histories and engaging different kind of epistemologies or theories, but you're trying to come up with like a framework for us to understand what's unfolding before us. So I think as anyone that would be hard, but for a historian who's used to thinking about the past in a particular way, this was a challenge. But I also read it as a kind of generational biography. Like a lot of the activists that you tell this, you recount or you show how they kind of came of age politically and grappled with a lot of the Black feminist frameworks that you were talking about earlier, that we see them coming of age and we see them developing these political identities in real time. And so I guess my question for everyone on the panel is, you know, how did you come to this movement? And then how did this movement change you? Because I think all of us were political people, leftists, black radicals before, and yet something else happened as a result of us participating in these movements. And so how did you come to this work, and how did it change you? So I'll start with Nyle.
Okay. Hi, everybody. How's everybody doing? It's good to see y'all. I'm still getting over the epilogue. I mean, it felt like a big hug. This felt really good. It felt really good. Thank you. So I came, I was a seminarian at Princeton Theological Seminary. I had already been politicized my first semester by a political prisoner by the name of Mumia Abu Jamal. So I had a sense of what Black people were up against and sort of the history of this country. And I had planned on applying to PhD programs. I was going to take a year to do that. And then, so I graduated in May. And then in August, on August 9th, Michael Brown was killed by Darren Wilson in Ferguson, Missouri. And we had been seeing, I remember I was right here in Newark when the non-indictment of George Zimmerman happened. I remember how angry I was. I went to my friend's house in Irvington, New Jersey. We sat in the basement of his house. And we did things I won't talk about. We were mad. We were drinking, whatever. We were just mad. We were talking politics. So this was a cycle, but it was something about how the people responded in Ferguson to Darren Wilson killing Mike Brown, and seeing the images online. I was just thinking to myself, I can go get a PhD if I get into a program, but what is that gonna mean for people who look like me? What is it gonna mean for my nephews, for my nieces, for my family? I live on Martin Luther King Boulevard, right up the street. So I was wrestling with that, and I was angry. The short answer, I won't talk too long, but I was angry, like to the point where I couldn't sit down in my chair and finish the application without doing something. So I got on a bus. There were bus rides that were organized to go to Ferguson, and I just got on the bus. I really didn't know what to expect. I didn't know what was gonna happen. I just knew that I needed to do something with my Black body, because I just didn't want to be another sort of successful person, while people who look like me were facing hell. So that's why I went, because I was angry.
Hi, everybody. I'm happy to be here. Nice to see your faces. So I've been in the States for about 8 years now, and I came over here for college, university from Trinidad, which is where I grew up. And, I think there was a lot that I was trying to make sense of in that move, because a big part of the reason I decided to come over here was everybody just had this sense, and I think if you grew up there, from the time you're small, you kind of primed to leave, right? Like if you're smart enough, if you're bright enough, then the definition of success is that you get out of this small place and you move either to England or the States, and you make something of yourself, and you don't look back, and you don't go home. And so I didn't come here exactly with that understanding that I was gonna come to like never go back. But I think that I was in a lot of ways trying to make sense of like who I was in this new space, and who I was, who I was growing into. And I think that along that process, like a lot of questions that kept coming up was sort of like, why is that? Why is it that like from the time you're like this high, the idea is that this is not a place worth staying? And I, while I was in school, I had the opportunity to join a couple different organizations that sort of got me closer to that answer. And one of them, or I would say the one that had the biggest impact on me, was Students Against Mass Incarceration, which is where I learned about abolition for the first time. And sort of beyond the scope of just what mass incarceration meant as something that was affecting Black people disproportionately, and more about like the roots of racial capitalism and why it necessitated incarceration in the first place, and how that was connected to the chronic underdevelopment of the place that I was from, and how that was connected to you know, even the things that I thought I was escaping by leaving, right? And so coming out, you know, and you know, growing into a young woman who didn't want to be told or didn't want to be sort of confined by these really rigid understandings of what gender was and what it should be and how I should be within it. It wasn't until I started learning about abolition that I sort of started to have a language for explaining it that did not leave me and my people in this position of the primitive savages. And so it was in that organization that I had experience with my first campaign, which was to divest from the private prisons that Columbia had its stock in, and with the understanding at the time that really in the larger scope of the prison industry, right, private prisons make up a relatively small proportion of of that industry. But it was to use that campaign as an opportunity to talk to the people around us about prisons and jails and about what we were understanding ourselves as meaning when we're saying there are certain people who need to be locked away, right? It sounded a lot to me like the narrative I had in my own mind about my own people, just like, well, we're just backwards, right? Like that's the simple explanation for it. And so that was really the place that I feel like I was politicized in that very specific way. And it was around that time as well that I was graduating that Mike Brown was murdered in Ferguson. And at the time, I had a few friends who were in Cop Watch in Harlem, up in Harlem, and so they were organizing caravans down to Ferguson, and there's just this sense, right, of urgency, like we have to do something. We don't know exactly what, but we have to do something. And I went down to Ferguson, and it was at that point they were just in the thick of the protests that had been going on for about a week at that point. And I had just never seen anything like it. People were out in the streets every single day. People who didn't know each other were like forming connections. It was young people, very clearly young Black people who were at the head of these like formations, and it was anger, and it was righteous anger, and it wasn't respectable anger, which is what I think a lot of us had grown up sort of seeing or having modeled to us, whether or not it was like the civil rights movement or like the independence movement in the Caribbean, right? We had this idea that sort of we just politely negotiated our way to freedom. And it was the first time that I had seen something that was like, oh no, there's something in my belly almost that's telling me this is how this happens, right? This is how things shift and change. And so when I came back, I had a friend, actually, Barbara's daughter, who I went to school with, who was telling me about this organization called BYP 100. And she had been talking about them for a while, just like she had been talking about Chicago for a while, every other sentence. And so, she ended up inviting us to come to Chicago, some of the folks who were in Students Against Mass Incarceration, to kind of just see what it was all about. And we ended up meeting some of the folks in the Chicago chapter. I think at that point we only had 2 chapters. And again, there was that feeling, that shift, that sort of like gut level intuition that these young people understand the stakes of what we're up against, and are not just about trying to negotiate or talk really nicely about it, but are moving with purpose, and with a sort of disregard about what anybody else thought about it. And so I would say that was like that's it. BYP 100 has been my political home for a long time, and that's so much of how I came to it, was this feeling that after sort of almost a lifetime of being told, we as Black people used to struggle, and now we're not struggling anymore. And that disconnect, when like you look at the world around you, you just know that's not true, right? People being willing to be honest about that, and to take risk in the face of that, I think was a really huge part of my politicization.
So how did it change?
Right. My politicization went back way before.
Yeah.
Way before 2012. In fact, my sister-in-law, Pam Sporn, is here, who just did a film called Detroit 48202, which is about Detroit and features, sort of glimpses of activists in Detroit who were inspiring to me when I was growing up. People like General Baker, who worked in League of Revolutionary Black Workers, and others, Grace Lee Boggs. But I've been an activist for a long time, and around a number of issues, from anti-racism to anti-apartheid work to feminist organizing. And I think this moment, and these two in particular, they're so dear to me. But I think I've been learning how to do intergenerational work better. And I always say I try to be a well-behaved elder. I don't really like that term, elder. I'm trying to disabuse them of it, but we say we're yeldas, we're young elders. But I also think that there are models for doing intergenerational work, which is you kind of get rolled out, you dispense a little wisdom, then you kind of get rolled back. But I think what we're trying to do in this work is to be reciprocal, and it's not just and then people sort of default to something, say, yeah, well, you have wisdom and we have energy, but I'm like, you have wisdom too, because the more we talk, it's not linear, right? You don't have wisdom from 40 years ago because you weren't there, but you are navigating a landscape that I only see from a distance, and I have to appreciate that. That's a different form of political wisdom that's being brought to meetings and demonstrations and so forth and so on. So I think the biggest impact on my own political practice has been to try to do the intergenerational work with integrity, but also with being mindful of the ways in which we sabotage that routinely.
Yeah, I'll answer as well. I think in terms of my own intellectual work, as many of you know, I've been working on this project on Nina Simone. I've been tracking Nina Simone's resurgence in American culture since 2007. And I was struggling with what does she mean for us now? And then Black Lives, this movement happened, and the answer was before me, because you had queer Black people who were embracing, or like you said, kind of disrupting narratives of respectability and embracing rage. And I think that shift, I was struggling, why is Nina so important, the way James Baldwin's so important? And the movement helped me understand my own fascination and the ways in which those figures are oftentimes central to the civil rights movement, but still were marginalized because of all the ways in which they didn't fit into that kind of heteronormative, charismatic male leader narrative. So to see that blossom in this moment, I think. And then just for me also, just really thinking about taking the project of Black feminism really seriously and using it to think about when we mean violence, what does that mean? What are the relationship between police violence, state violence, and what people call interpersonal violence? What's the relationship between gun violence in the United States and then it being exported as a part of American militarism? So those questions were always there for me, but as an activist and as a theorist, I take them more seriously and try to figure out, that comes from Black Lives Matter, because for me, when George Zimmerman killed Trayvon Martin, but knowing that he had this history of domestic violence and sexual assault that predates his murder of Trayvon, but it becomes getting away with it becomes a template for his behavior. Those kind of connections happened in a way that were new to me, and so that's just two ways I think. I guess I want to follow up with this.
Can I just say something?
Yeah.
But in the work that you've done around sexual violence has been so important and powerful with girls, but the correlation between a lot of mass shootings as well as other forms of interpersonal violence has often been correlated to domestic violence, and that I think that's something that feminist thinkers and doers have brought to the fore, and you have in your work. But
yeah,
thank you.
So I guess my question is, I was thinking about when Michael Dawson's book came out when I was in graduate school, and he was naming the different kind of political ideologies that Black people have embraced. And in that book, Black Feminism he described it as a kind of bourgeois, so most Black people weren't Black feminists, and it was an academic enterprise, or at least mostly a bourgeois kind of political ideology. And yet this movement...
He's changed his mind.
No, obviously, yeah, I assume so. And at the time, he was wrong as well. But that's a... But the point is that, like, this movement, I think, like as you were talking about in your book, really shows how, like, Black feminism being put into the kind of political economy and practice of activists. And so I guess I have a question for everyone on the panel, too, is, like, you know, how do you practice Black feminism in this movement? What's your relationship to Black feminism in the movement for Black Lives Matter? Because it's a central part of your book, actually, intergenerationality and intersectionality. And so I just want to talk about that.
I'll start us well. Do we get pre-questions? I don't remember. Did we get a little rehearsal?
I sent some things to consider.
I'm having to think fast because she's yeah, I mean, the contribution I would make is I was very pleased when I went to Ferguson and interviewed some of the young activists, and when I interviewed, Brittany Farrell and Alicia Saunier and Kayla Reed, who were people who were politicized in the context of the Ferguson moment, who also found their feminist politics in the context of that, right? So dispelling the notion that, everybody has to go to a, gender and women's studies class. It comes from these bourgeois theorists that nobody understands. I mean, they got their feminism, their Black feminism, on the streets of Ferguson, right? When they were dealing with sexism in the movement, when they were also navigating who they were and how to come out as who they were in the movement, and realizing all the other layers of stuff that were weighing down on them, in addition to racism and police violence. And so I think to talk about that kind of organic coming into consciousness around feminism and the importance of gender and sexuality in the work that we do, I was pleased that I was able to document that, because I think it does dispel some of the what you were describing that Michael Dawson once wrote, and probably wants to erase now. But yeah, we love Michael. Anyway, so I'm interested in what you all have to say too.
So I think, one of the things that BYP 100 says is that we believe in a black queer feminist future, or we organize through a Black queer feminist lens. And in that's like a lot of words to really say that what we understand when we talk about like building meaningful power starts with the most marginalized within our communities, right? And so if we are going to fight in a meaningful way for the Black community, then we have to look at those links like Barbara's talking about between the way that interpersonal violence between people, individuals, right, and state-sanctioned violence are interlinked in a way that you cannot separate, right? They're just inherently intertwined. And so, we get a lot of flack, actually, from certain people within our communities, a lot of times, often young Black men who think that because we are trying to put a focus on folks within our community who aren't typically lifted up, that it means that we're actually trying to leave them behind. And the thing that we have had to try and find a way of explaining over and over again is that when we say the most marginalized, we're not talking about one static figure, right? What we're saying is that within this society, the way that it works is that you almost have a matrix, right, of identities, and depending on where you fall in that matrix, it will sort of define the kind of vulnerabilities, right, that you're exposed to throughout your entire life. It will define how long or short your life is. It will define what kind of access to medical care you have. It will define how much pain you have to manage on your own versus not, right? And so for us, I think what it meant was centering not just people in the sense of like, okay, we have a Black woman speaking, or a Black trans woman speaking, or a Black poor person speaking. It meant that we had to center also the issues that shape and defined our lives, because unless we were addressing those violences, there was no way that the rest of us collectively were ever going to get free. And so, yeah, that's how I think that Black feminism has sort of defined how I've learned about and moved through this space. Yeah.
I think that I had an assumption that feminism was not for me because I was a boy and a young man. One thing that the movement has taught me is that feminism, particularly Black feminism, is actually, especially for me as a young man. Patriarchy, I learned, does a particular kind of violence on girls and women and femmes, but it also does violence on boys and men. So like when I was growing up, I had older men say stuff like, be a man. And I wasn't even tall enough to get on my favorite roller coaster yet. Like for real. So like if I'm a young man showing certain types of sensitivity or crying, right? That type of stuff is not allowed. So from a very young age, I was told what was okay and what was not okay, what was acceptable and unacceptable, how to perform as a so-called man. And so in many ways, Black feminism has saved my life. It's allowed for me to, on a personal and interpersonal level, not just treat my mama really good, but the young women in my life terribly, and have that kind of dichotomy. And so on that interpersonal level, but also in my political life, I'm a minister. So I became a minister when I was 16 years old.
And he can preach too.
She brag on me all the time. I like it. I ain't gonna lie. I like it a little bit. But I became a minister when I was 16 years old. And I'm 28 now. So for over a decade, when I go into a church and talk, pretty much everybody listens. I could say kind of whatever. It's crazy. It's crazy. And a part of that I realize is because of my identity, because churches have been conditioned, and not just churches, but academia, movement spaces have been conditioned by patriarchy, by misogyny, to listen to somebody like me. And so a part of the work, I think for me, is to learn how to listen, to recognize why I get certain opportunities and other folks don't get that. Not just recognize it, but start to pass on some of those opportunities to folks who don't necessarily get those opportunities, to women. And so I want to say this lastly, it's something I'm still working on. For me, it's a lifelong process. And it's not just a label you wear, hopefully, but it's something that you practice in your everyday life. And there's some people who talk about feminism very eloquently on stages, some of them who are men, but they don't necessarily practice that. And so one thing that I want to think about is, what does it mean, right? And I know preachers who preach real good on Sunday, but so what does it mean to actually practice the politics of feminism and Black feminism in our everyday lives? And it's messy and it's hard, but there's a lot to learn. And I'm just appreciative of the work y'all have all put in.
I have two more questions. I'm going to open it up to the audience. One, the book opens with a chasm, I think that's the right word, between having Obama as the president and then the emergence of this movement. And the way that you frame it in the book, obviously part of it is that there was this kind of muted dissent, right? That there were ways in which people who would typically who would typically speak out against the president felt as if they shouldn't, because of a kind of cult of protection of Black male leaders, right? But I also wanted to think about what Obama's presidency, how did it help make this movement possible? If that's one way of thinking about it. So there's a muted dissent, and yet the movement happens. And so I guess that's one thing, the relationship between respectability and rage, or respectability and a kind of pushing back against that. But how did we think about that with this emergence of this movement as Obama was president? You talk about it in the book, but I want us to kind of theorize, because now we're in a very different moment. Mm-hmm. And so I'm, so what made that, what made this possible, and then what is possible now? So anyone can answer. I can answer too, but I'm going to wait till you all.
Why don't you answer?
Oh, well, it's weird for me to answer the question I just asked.
We want a little of your shine.
Yeah, my questions are part of my shine, but I'll answer after someone else answers. So, does anyone have any thoughts about Obama?
Well, I think it was Jelani Cobb who said, had this quote. He said, maybe we had to have a black president to understand the limits of a black president, right? And a number of people I interview, from Charlene Carruthers to Tef Poe, talk about the hope that they had and the expectation. And there was kind of waiting, right, to be delivered, even though their political sensibilities they knew, right, that a president is not going to deliver salvation. But there was this expectation that great things were going to happen, and when great things didn't happen, it's kind of all we got is us. So I think that was one dynamic, the sense of perhaps hope and possibility. People in different stages or phases or types of politicization might have felt differently, right? But I think there was some expectation, and the failure to deliver politicized a lot of people that weren't. But I also think, it's both. The question, did the presidency make possible certain things, but did certain things also happen in spite of? Yeah. Because I think all of the forces that made people hesitant to criticize him initially continued to be present, right? Yeah. But I think conditions have become such that maybe even if Obama wasn't president, right, that this would have developed. And I also believe, history is a combination of conditions and agency, and it's not predetermined, right? So the conditions were there, and then there was the agency of the people that responded to those conditions in the way that they did. And I don't think we can. There's not a formula for that. I wish there was, but there's not. And so I think it was a whole bunch of variables, and that's how I would, in general, respond.
Yeah, and I guess just to follow up, I guess less about Obama, but another theme that you talk about in the book is the emergence of these new technologies of communication. And so in some ways, the kind of diffusing of a centralized authority or voice with Twitter, or to a certain degree. Obviously now that's also problematic. Like Facebook and Twitter are not, we don't think of them the way we would have actually then. But so that kind of decentralized communication, which then the movement both mirrors in terms of like the leaderfulness, as well as there's the problematic nature of those social media technologies. You also talk about in the book, which I thought was really useful. But Obama is the president before Trump who really takes advantage of these new digital platforms, and we see them as a place of democratization in terms of his campaign. And so it is interesting, and also makes sense that the movements themselves would then take that up and then expand them in ways that we've never seen before. So that's just one thing with the Obama moment. I do think, though, and then you may all disagree with me, that under a Trump, this is your title, the hopefulness and the danger, and Obama represented hope. You knew there was danger because he's president of the United States, so there's obviously danger there. But he ran on hope, and so I think you're right to point out like this major disillusionment with having this person in power, and yet he speaks to the country as if he can't be protected from white supremacy. I think was really the movement pushes him to make certain kinds of claims, which I think is really important. But also the chasm. The other thing I want to say is like the term white supremacy. Like I feel like that is so part of the parlance now, and that's because of the movement for Black Lives Matter. I feel like when I was in college, white supremacy, we would use that word, but it would be part of like a kind of Black nationalist discourse, and the way that just has quickly like intersectionality. They're part of the framework today. That's also like a kind of outcome of the movement in a way that just a couple of years changed. Okay, so my last question is this title of Hopeful and Danger, and I was wondering how it resonates with, Barbara actually had a much longer title, but Hopeful and Dangerous were in it. And what your original title was like the left in Hopeful and Dangerous time, like what the movement does to the left, what it can give to the left, what it pushes the left to be, and but this idea of hopeful and dangerous, and I found that really exciting because I do think it's dangerous times, but I like the idea that there's a hopefulness at the same time. So, are those the words that you would use to describe your work in this moment, or describe this moment, or are there other adjectives that you want to throw out? And then we move to the audience, because I didn't include a question about strategizing in this. How do we strategize in this hopeful, dangerous time? Maybe the best. How do we organize maybe differently? Just looking, you can go. Yeah.
You got 2 or 3 questions there.
I know. Hopeful, danger, and then organizing. Yeah.
Well, okay, so I think the thing that I was thinking about when you were talking about Obama and what it means to have, or, you know, needing to have a Black president to realize the limits of one, you know, again, as a Caribbean, because if there's one place where you can see a pretty, like, serious history of the limits of representational politics, it's there, right? And so, you know, coming from a place where, like, the people who look like you definitely are not doing for you. Not necessarily, right? And understanding how much more that is about a structure than it is about any particular individual, I think it's just instructive for not just what we need to be focusing on, but especially like how colonialism has evolved in like this neoliberal like age, right? Because what neoliberalism wants to do is anything but be clear about what direction resources are flowing in and where they're being pushed to and who they're being kept from. Part of that, I think, you know, has a lot to do with in any case, I think that's part of what I think makes me feel like this is both a profoundly hopeful and dangerous moment, is because it is in moments like this that we're kind of tempted by the sort of like cult of personality, just focus on the personality, focus on the individual, and not the larger structures. And I think that, you know, even as you say, with like white supremacy being, you know, more of like in the lingo that people, I think anti-Blackness specifically is something that I've only heard become more popular in the past couple years. And I think that part of that has to do with something that this generation is particularly fed up of, which is a sort of like melding together. Everything is everything, right? Like we're all in this together. And it's like, no, we're not. And as long as we're not willing to be specific about the ways that our challenges are different and where resources are going and where they're not, we're going to end up in a place where the people who have been deemed the most disposable continue to be, and where that category only widens. And so that's some of what I think about. I mean, I think there's like a lot of other questions about strategy I also have. I think things are gonna get worse before they get better. But yeah, those are just some of the things that I think about when I think about the moment that we're in right now with 45.
Yeah, I think the limits of the Black president also makes me think about the limits of Black political leadership class here in the United States, which we've had since, I mean, decades, right? Newark has been a Black city for decades. Atlanta, Detroit, you know, we can look at Black political leadership class and its history and the limits of it. But it also makes me think about the limits of bad identity politics. So I think the critique of Obama from Black Lives Matter as a Black president, I begin to see applied more generally. And what I mean by that is, it was this interesting moment where people were like, oh snap, Black people can disagree. Right? That's a part of what happened. It's like, well, I thought y'all all agreed on things, right? And so there's this moment where we see that your identity doesn't say anything necessarily about your politics. And so it's like, oh, well, we have Black people who are radical, we have Black people who are conservative, we have Black people who are liberal. There's a sort of ambiguity within Black politics itself. And that's very important, because a lot of times the politics of identity is substituted for a more substantive set of politics, which is actually transformative. It's a part of what was said earlier. We just have a Black person speak and represent. It's a part of the problem of Black representational leaders, and they be speaking for all Black people. So a part of, I think, what this movement has done is to say, well, being the Black president is not enough, but being Black is not enough either, if your politics ain't good, right? And so I think that's very important. In terms of this moment, what I'm very nervous about is the consensus around anti-Trumpism. I think it's very important, but it's very limited. So I want to emphasize that it is important, but the so-called resistance, a part of what I'm afraid is happening is that we're losing the actual contestation within the left. So it's hard for us to begin a debate about very serious issues of what do we do with policing. Okay, we can agree that policing is bad, But then what? So you have folks who are pushing for abolition, who want to imagine what a world is like without police altogether, or to imagine society that doesn't need police in the first place, which will then make us ask questions about inequality and others, and the like. So I want to think about, and I think this book is a great occasion for us to talk about, have a more sophisticated and a more deeper conversation about those contestations, about what kind of world do we actually want to see. Saying that we don't like Trump is clearly not going to be enough, even though what's hopeful is that I think some folks are beginning to say, well, there's something really wrong with this country. It's kind of really obvious now. For some of us, it's been obvious, but for others, it's a new moment. And I think those of us who are organizing activists should welcome those folks in and begin to have those deep conversations about what kind of world do we want to live in.
Yeah. I mean, ditto. I think that for me, the dangerous and hopeful political moment is, I do think there are some very profound crises, that exist in our society right now that, that sometimes we gloss over in discussions. And I think Nile's point about Trump is an important one, in that, in terms of how we fight Trump, how the resistance mobilizes. And yes, I think it suppresses debates on the left and among progressives, but it also has lowered the bar so low that there's a kind of anybody but Trump. Well, gee, anybody but Trump could be, well, let's say his vice president, or a military leader that can offer, can save us from the chaos. I mean, that is the primer for fascism, right? Somebody that makes the trains run on time, somebody that's not reckless and all over the place. The anti-Trump discourse is one that actually sets the stage for certain kinds of things that could be as bad or worse. And I think a lot of liberals are getting on board with it because people feel so desperate and so frustrated with the madness. So I think being mindful of that is really important. That's one of the dangers is how, that there is resistance, but what is the nature of the resistance? What is the consensus within the resistance, I think, is a really important question. But I think hopeful too in another way, and I am so not the glass half full person. I'm usually glass is half empty, there's a hole in the glass, so I'm always worried. But I'm hopeful, there are a number of organizing efforts going on. And the thing that frustrates me so much in watching MSNBC and CNN is they are so Trump obsessed that there have been more people doing more and more engaged forms of politics, right? Getting arrested, people who've never been arrested before, people who've never gone to a demonstration before, people who never gave money to certain kinds of things before, are in motion. And some of it's Trump, but also some of it is the movement for Black lives. Some of it is the large immigration rights movement. Some of it is the growing, Palestine solidarity movement. I mean, there are movements in motion before Trump, and I think that part of the intervention, right, is the hysteria built around, who's taking over and what what progressives and what the left is demanding. But the majority is a coalition of 56 organizations that was formed by the Movement for Black Lives. It ranged from climate change activists to immigration rights activists to labor organizers, Fight for 15 folks, as well as, SEIU. Many of the teachers' unions are involved. There's also the Grassroots Global Justice Alliance, which is a much more progressive and radical move within the climate change movement, environmental justice movement, which has been overwhelmingly white, has begun to take up other kinds of issues. So connections are being made. Even the Women's March, which I have certain criticisms of, right? There has been a real struggle and a push within the Women's March to deal with issues of race and white supremacy, right? And class. I mean, Linda Sarsour was one of the people arrested at the Kavanaugh thing, and it wasn't just about Roe v. Wade. So I see people making certain kinds of connections, reaching out. We have a coalition in Chicago, and Chicago is an interesting place. I have a chapter in the book on Chicago, because there's a lot of activism and a lot of political movements have been born there, but it's also a very divided city. I mean, historically very racially divided, but also politically divided. You have 50 neighborhoods and 75 neighborhood organizations, So, but we've been able to develop this coalition, which came about right after the election in 2016, and we sent out a letter, an email saying, what next, what now? And so we all kind of came together and we argued for the first few meetings, but it has kind of held together for these 2 years, and I think is poised to influence the mayoral elections that are coming up. And we now have the mayor who's done a lot of damage to our city about who's not going to run, so it creates certain possibilities. There's dangers there too in terms of people doing work in the electoral arena without a connection to movement and without a plan for accountability for politicians. So I think each angle that we look and find hope, there's also danger, and each point where we look and find danger, you look a little further and there's a little bit of hope. So I think, again, our agency, what we do or don't do, will determine what the next period looks like.
Okay, I'll open it up to the audience. Let me just check my time here. I think we have about 15 minutes, and then we'll wrap it up.
Sorry for the long answer.
No,
Long-winded
don't
answer.
apologize. Don't apologize. Yeah. Okay. If you could just say your name, I guess. Then what? Yeah. Thank you. Hi.
Yes, my name is Junius Williams. Until recently, associated with Rutgers University. Hi, Nancy. Yes. Yes, we did. I've enjoyed this conversation, and I'm going to definitely learn some more from your book. I want to give a brief example and then ask a question. Back in the 1960s, the late 1960s, we had a coalition of organizations. One was the Welfare Rights Organization, one was NAPA, the Newark Area Planning Association, and the other was the Black Organization of Students. So we had analysis. I agree with your analysis. We had understanding of how the system worked. I understand that you understand that. But we had sustained pressure through the politics of confrontation. I mean, every week we were doing something. Just to use the welfare example, there were takeovers of the welfare offices that wouldn't give checks to the women who deserved them. As a result, the Welfare Rights Organization, we call them the Welfare Mamas, came to understand politics more. They were the first real feminists in the movement here. Those of us who had been used to following men understood that we now could follow women. So there was a kind of growth and understanding. But the constant thing we had together was the fact that we were in motion, confronting, making it impossible for the system to work unimpeded on a weekly, sometimes daily basis. I want to know how that's coming forward through the Black Lives Matter movement. Maybe I've missed something, maybe I've been misled, but where is the constant pressure coming on the system so much so that they can't ignore you?
I think actually that's the other piece that I didn't mention before about what has felt so good to come into this movement in this period of time is that there's a lot of ways in which young people have been actively discouraged from confronting power outside of prescribed means, right? So in other words, every single time we get loud or we turn up, we get told, no, there's another way to do this, right? And part of what learning more about activism and organizing has meant for us is learning more about what power is, right? And understanding that power can seize nothing without a demand. So I'll speak maybe just briefly to BYP 100 in New York City, and if you want to add to that, you can. Right now, they're working on a campaign to end permanent exclusion in public housing. So if anybody who doesn't know what permanent exclusion is, it's essentially a policy that says if you are even arrested you can be kicked out of public housing. And not only that, but if your family member or a loved one is found to be hiding you in that house or in that home, they can be kicked out as well. And so New York City's first campaign has been a campaign against permanent exclusion. We partnered up with a lot of different housing activists and organizations around the city. We have built with NYCHA residents, hosted parties, done political education, because the fact is also that not everybody in NYCHA disagrees with that policy, right? So a lot of it has been building those relationships, getting to know one another, and then doing direct actions to confront the folks who have the power to change those policies. Another thing that they have done pretty successfully is they had I was gonna say a Confederate statue. It pretty much amounts to the same. J. Marion Sims, there's a statue of him was a statue of him up in Harlem, and he is known as the father of gynecology in traditional medicine. He experimented, performed surgery on enslaved women in order to learn the things that he did, right, to become the father of gynecology. The chapter did a series of direct action protests where they dressed up in hospital gowns that were bloody to sort of like just bring, around the time where a lot of other statues were being taken down in different cities as well, to just highlight the fact that we shouldn't be celebrating this person, and we're able to successfully get it taken down. The other thing that they're doing actually today is all across the city, they are doing swipe it forward actions. And I think in New York City, it's close to the #1 reason why people get arrested is fear hopping. And the interesting thing about it is a lot of the organizations that were more formally working on that issue were not taking a decriminalization approach to it at all. They were saying, well, people need more money, so we need more funding to get more cards and that kind of thing, instead of taking the position that the reason why people are being targeted this way is because 92% of the people who end up getting arrested for this are Black, are brown, often formerly incarcerated. And what you're saying essentially is that if you're too poor to afford to get on the train, right, that what we're going to do instead is either fine you or lock you up. And so what they've been doing in stations where those arrests have been highest is swiping folks in, right, it's particularly Black and brown folks, and just making a lot of noise, getting in police officers' faces who are there doing constant patrolling, right, trying to catch people out. Just trying to raise awareness and trying to push, especially our mayor, who ran on this platform of like police accountability and reform, right? And has not followed through at all, trying to push him to actually put his money where his mouth is. So those are just some of the things. I don't want to take up too much time talking about that, but it is an understanding that we have, which is that we're not going to get this by just like having meetings with like public officials. We got to get loud. We got to make noise. We got to stop business as usual.
Wanted to lift up a little bit of what Barbara Ramsey said in the book about these political quilters in the tradition of Ella Baker. One thing, when I got back from Ferguson here to Newark, I was really angry about police violence. In my conversations with people, that actually wasn't the thing that was sticking here in Newark. Issues around education, because this was a time, it had been since 1995 that people had local control of education. Barringer High School was running out of food, and kids didn't have food for lunch, so the kids walked out. So education was a big issue, and some others. I want to shout out Okaikor, who was a part of some of this work we were doing down in Newark. So a part of it was like everything we were doing, especially I know for me as young people, was wrong. It's like if we protested, y'all need to study, y'all need to go and do formal politics. And then if we were out on the streets too much, y'all need to study. And then we study, you're not out on the streets enough. And so one thing that I've just been struggling with is just having the resources, because it takes an enormous amount of resources to do this kind of work when you're working, when you have family members who are incarcerated, when you have student loans, when you have all these issues. And I think one thing that we need to do, especially for young organizers, and this is why I shout out Barbara Ramsey so much, who's in addition to all the writing and all the teaching, it flew people across the country to Chicago to just talk about organizing. I've been in those meetings. And all the people in the room who do that, I want to just honor you and thank you so much for providing those resources. But we need more of it. Young activists need space. We were meeting, Kai knows, we were meeting in the second floor of Source and Knowledge bookstore on Broad Street. And that was just through, my mama had a relationship with Dexter, and Dexter knew me, but that was impromptu. That was makeshift. I just stopped in there one day, was like, yo, could we use upstairs? Yes. So having more resources so that we can think, so that we can imagine, so that we can have poster boards when we do go out in the street, so that we can have people who are watching out for the police. Those things are really important. We were building something here in Newark, and I think one of the challenges was just sheer resources. And so I would love to talk to more folks, specifically here in Newark, about how we can provide resources for people around my age, 18 to 35 or so. And there is some work being done, but there's a lot more that can be done, I think, if we put our minds together to give us more resources to do that.
Yes, good evening. My name is Parrish King. I'm a student here at Rutgers-Newark. I'm a formerly incarcerated male, spent 17 years in prison, but was fortunate enough to get into a college program while in prison, which now has allowed me to be at Rutgers. And my question is this. Just based upon history, we know that this country, Black lives doesn't matter. It was founded on Black lives not mattering. And I'm not here to criticize, I'm here to ask a question. Are we putting energies into establishing our own institutions rather than trying to force our way into an institution that doesn't want us to be there? Can we begin to put energy into forming our own institutions so that they would want to come to our institutions rather than us trying to force our way into their institutions?
Well, I guess thank you for your question. I was thinking, I never really saw this movement as one that was about integration in the sense of how we think about that from the 60s, meaning that what I think is fascinating, what is exciting, was a movement about Black people loving Black people and expanding the definition of of Blackness, what that means, who's in the category of Blackness, as you said, the most vulnerable. So I think for me, it always comes from that place, and yet there's a deep recognition of the ways in which our humanity, which is always, like you said, the country's built on the fact that we're seen as less than human. The movement was demanding that recognition takes place. But I never saw it as a movement. I mean, Barbara doesn't really talk about this in her book as much, but I do think this is where it's bringing all these different kind of movements together. It's bringing the civil disobedience aspects of the civil rights movement. It's bringing a Black nationalist sensibility. It's bringing kind of AIDS activism that we saw with ACT UP, with the die-ins. It's bringing Black feminism. I mean, there's so many movements that this movement builds on and expands. And so I guess I think it's such an expansive movement that I don't think at its core it's really about asking white people to see us as human, but there is something about Black people recognizing the humanity in each other, and then it goes from there. So that's just a kind of reframing, I guess I would. But
so what is the end result of what's being taken place? What are we looking for? Mm-hmm. What if you got to the perfect place, what would it look like?
That's the question, isn't it? But even more, I'm going to answer your question actually, but even more fundamental than like what is it that we're looking for is the who is the we. And I think for me, and both Nyle and Imani spoke to this before, I see this not as a nationalist movement, but as an internationalist movement, and informed by the sensibilities of people who come out of a colonial context where they understand that race is complicated and it's not, that the politics are not neatly color-coded. So then when we say we, if we are talking about dispossessed people, if we are talking about people whose political vision of a different kind of society is shared, then we're talking about, it's a different kind of we. So then we're talking about different possibilities. So when we say our institutions, I mean historically Black colleges, for example. a lot of problematics there. I mean, it started in many contexts with white philanthropy and embraced very conservative practices of socializing students. So even when we think of institutions as quote unquote ours as Black people, they can be very problematic. So to me, we have to be more ambitious than that. What I think is important about this movement, and again, I think there has, to answer Junius's question too, I think there has been a lull since Trump was elected in terms of the ongoing, seeing people in the streets and all that. And I think, we should talk about why that is, or even self-critically. But I think it's related. But I think a strength that has persisted is people are looking for alternatives. They're not just saying, we don't like the cops. They're saying, this is what restorative justice looks like. They're not just saying, we don't like capitalism. They're saying, let's build solidarity economies and cooperatives, right? So they're not just saying, go out and vote. They're saying, let's build accountability mechanisms and critical engagement with the electoral arena, not just do it the way we've always done it. So I do see the exploration of alternatives as kind of getting at that question. But the more fundamental kind of gut level reaction to that, and this is hard for me to land there, I think we do want freedom to be a destination, and I think it's a process. I think that every time you overcome a hurdle and certain kinds of injustices, you find other ones, right? There's always other ways to make things more just, more humane, more inclusive. And so I don't think of the work as getting us to that point or getting us to some finite point, but I think of it as a process, like a constant process of struggle. And for me, it's around economic justice. It's around validating the humanity of everyone. It's about not throwing anybody under the bus. It's about resources that are shared and not hoarded by, elites. And those are some, just some basic, kind of things. But I think too, you mentioned that you were formerly incarcerated. The work that's going on inside. There's a recent prison strike, right? And it was about slave labor. And I just had one of the, big difficult meeting that I was in. I didn't convene it, but I just happened to be in the room, was talking with labor leaders about how we see the exploitation of prison labor as a part of building a labor movement, right? And to me, that is a Black feminist praxis, right? That's incorporating race and labor and all of these various issues that are happening at the same time. The firefighters, making $1 a day out in California fighting those fires, it's slave labor. It's incarcerated workers being paid $1 a day. Like, how can that not be an issue for our major trade unions? I know I'm getting off of the point, but I had to get that in there. But that question of not just what we're against, but what we're for, that's the question we have to ask ourselves, I think, every single day that we do this work.
So time for one more question. Or two more questions.
I'll pass.
Why don't we just take your question and then we'll take the question. We'll take them at the same time.
Okay. Hi, my name is Derica Purnell. I'm a lawyer and activist. Thank you. This has been so great. My question is multi-part. It's just drawn from something that Imani said about abolition. Now your comments about the dynamism of the Black Lives Matter movement. People have different politics. And then Dr. Ransby, what you've been talking about in terms of Black feminism. And usually when I hear Black feminism, it's often in contrast or pitted against white feminism, right? It's just like, oh, Black feminists do this because it's a rejection of white feminism. And, Black women, as long as there have been Black women in this country, there's been like a feminist movement. I think I'm much more interested in carceral feminism and Black feminism relationship to the carceral state. Because too, I think Imani's pointing to Nyle's point, within the Black Lives Matter movement, you have Black feminists who are abolitionists. You also have those same Black feminists calling for killer cops to go to jail. Some of them, not all of them, yes. Right, that's what I'm saying. So the range. So I think that often gets to be a much more flattened conversation. I just would be curious to hear you guys talk about, what is Black feminist relationship to the carceral state? What are some of the debates? What are some of the contradictions, and how are they being reconciled? I think that would be particularly interesting instead of the not white feminism conversation.
Get your question as well.
I want to pivot on this. I'm really glad you asked that question. I really want to hear a response to that. But I would say that I'm really glad that they didn't bar the doors or for Bishop. I would have fought to get in here because I am in need and very hungry for a space to be thinking about how to deal with the shrinking imagination that I'm constantly feeling as we're bombarded in this space and with these set of challenges. And I'm activated by movements that are sustained in sports, for example. I mean, we see what Serena did and all the dimensions of that this past week, and I know you have this great article, New York Times piece about that, Dr. Tillet. And then also what Colin is doing and how Nike has, provided a mechanism to rebut some of the dominant discourse out of the, 46 minus 1. Y'all know what I mean? Right. So I'd love to, if possible, hear anything you have to say about how the out of the sports enterprise the reimagining of freedom is manifesting. But thank you.
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And I would say maybe one of the central things that I've struggled with in this movement is that, so BYP 100, I don't think started out as an explicitly abolitionist organization. When they first came together, it was a mix of folks, mostly on the left, but almost exclusively on the left, but with just different positions within that. It now is an abolitionist organization and says so explicitly. And a lot of the way that we got to that point was through political struggle with one another, right? Like trying to grapple with these different questions about, okay, so we're Black feminists, but what does that mean, not just in theory, but in praxis? And a big part of that, I think, has been we have had to learn within our own space how to manage harm and how to manage conflict and how not to conflate the two. In really practical, mechanical ways that we still don't have it all figured out by any means. But what we did realize was that there weren't a whole lot of people who kind of understood that process as being inherent to a Black liberation struggle, is that we need to find alternative ways of managing harm within our own spaces. And so we developed a Healing and Safety Council that is it's geared towards trying to manage those processes, and there have been different incidences with varying levels of being in the public eye or not, right? That we just on the day-to-day level have to figure out, what do we mean when we say harm? What is the role of this space in managing that, right? And how do we engage with each other in a principled way, in principled struggle? So I think, again, speaking a little bit to the little bit of a lull that we've seen, I think part of it is also just burnout. We had this phase of accelerated leadership development around 2013, 2014. And a lot of the aftermath of trying to grapple with these questions, which not a lot of our peers and not even some of the older folks around us had really grappled with before. I think we were really lucky to have sort of the leadership of elders from organizations like Critical Resistance and Insight, who understand that until we're able to deal with conflict internally in a healthy way, that we're not going to actually be able to free ourselves from some of the state-sanctioned violence that we face. And I guess, that's just a long way of saying that that's inherent, or it's fundamental to what our commitment, our political commitment is in terms of getting our people free, is to understand that we have to develop alternative ways of dealing with conflict that help get us clearer collectively on what we mean when we say safety. Safety for Black people, which is not the same thing as freedom from all pain and discomfort, right? But it is to say that we have to figure out a way to engage with each other in a way that does not replicate what the state does to us.
I guess I'll answer that question too, because I guess the other movement that I'm actively part of is Me Too. And so the question is, not to say that these are disparate movements, but the ways in which these questions about restorative justice, and how can it be applied in this other context? And by Me Too, I'm really thinking about Tirana and not even though I have been in spaces with like the kind of neoliberal Hollywood version of Me Too, I have been in those spaces as well. So, I think about what does it mean to kind of have these movements in conversation with each other? What can we learn in terms of violence against women, particularly sexualized violence, and then restorative justice? So I think these are, like, as Barbara said, we could have that. That's like the real kind of meat. Like, that's the conversations I think that we continue to need to have happen. But also, how can other movements learn from the movement for Black Lives, and how can this movement actually learn from those kind of the debates that we're having? I'm also writing this book on the color purple, and so I'm really looking at the ways in which Alice Walker kind of gives us a lot in that book about community and not throwing away people, but the process of accountability and the process of forgiveness and the process of wanting to be held accountable through the figure of, like, Mr., for example. So I think we also have, like, as Black feminism gives us so much all the time, that in those spaces, in the artistic realm, we actually have models and blueprints for some of the questions that we're grappling with in the present, too. So, and then the sports thing, yeah, I guess we could talk about that all night, too. Obviously, I can. But, yeah, there's a Washington Post op-ed about, like, Nike co-opting the movement. And I was like, yeah, that's true. That's true. But also, I think it's just a really interesting strategy for Kaepernick to be able to continue his lawsuit, right? Like, if Nike is thinks that he is financially worthy, whatever that means, then what does that mean in terms of his actual litigation? But I do think this is akin to the ways in which movements politicize and radicalize everyone. And so that's kind of why I wanted to open up the conversation with, like, how did this movement actually radicalize already radical people? I think we're all, and I know Barbara talked about her long history of organizing, but the movement does create something new in us. And so what is that? And I think it's been pretty astonishing to see how athletes and entertainers have been radicalized. There's, like, no other way to talk about it but that, including, Serena, but Colin Kaepernick especially. So I don't you want to talk about
just briefly, if trying to put these two questions together, I think the best of what I've learned of Black feminism, the best of what I've learned from carceral feminism, is to reject the concept of disposability, that people can be thrown away, whether they're in prisons or whether they're on street corners to sleep on at night. With this concept that some people are just not worthy of a life well lived. And so I think trying to connect that to the sports thing with particularly Colin Kaepernick, I think there's a moment of celebration, but we also have to think about what that celebration is predicated upon, thinking about third world feminisms and people who are working for this company, right? And so I think we can do both. I think there's a way to sort of highlight the ways in which Colin Kaepernick's and Serena Williams and other people's activism is sort of inspiring people to activate, but we cannot dispose of the people who live underneath our celebration. Because I think the best of these feminisms actually teach us the only thing we need to dispose of is disposability itself.
Okay. Oh, and then we'll give you the final word.
Oh, I don't know if it's profound or anything, but I want to thank you both for those questions. And the question you raised, Derica, I think we could talk about for a real long time. I mean, there's many layers of it. I mean, I describe myself as an abolitionist, but it's aspirational. And even if you think of the abolition of slavery, it wasn't just the abolition of slavery. I mean, in fact, many people wanted it to be just the abolition. Yeah, y'all free, see ya, I mean, but, we have to build a world where prisons are, as Angela says, as prisons are obsolete, right? We have to build a world, and which means also changing how we relate to each other. I mean, there's so many layers to that work, and Ruthie Gilmore and Angela Davis and Beth Ritchie talk about it more eloquently than I can. But some people think it's a presto, press a button. So for me, it's aspirational. Like, all of this work is about trying to create a world where prisons are not necessary and reducing them in this moment. I do think that sometimes, and a couple important experiences for me. I mean, I've been going to Stateville Prison and teaching a little bit there, and some of my best students, I'm telling you, just serious and all that. But Albert Woodfox, who was in Angola prison and who was in solitary confinement for 43 years, was in the Panthers and was released a couple of years ago, came and talked to us. And I remember there was a young abolitionist in the audience, and she got up, and he talked about some of the struggles they waged inside, which was remarkable. I mean, when I met the brother, I was, like anybody who's survived 43 years in solitary, I'm just like, I'm glad you're here and you're intact. I wasn't expecting any great political wisdom. But he talked about fighting rape in prison and forming anti-rape committees in prison, right? Which I thought was and he said, well, we learned from women who organize around, and we said, not on our watch, this won't happen to people coming in. So I thought that was an interesting lesson. But the young woman abolitionist who asked him a question, she said, well, I don't want to make prisons better. I want them to go away. And he, and his response was, well, that's easy from on the outside, but if you're inside, you also are trying to win certain victories that ameliorate the suffering at the same time that we try to change the entire system. I think that's lessons for our work in every realm, right? We want a different kind of society, but we also can't be so, insensitive or without compassion for changing things as little as they might be, in the here and now. So I think that's, how I try to balance my own thinking and work on this.